Before the curtain rises, an animal tamer comes out and tells us about all the cool animals we're gonna see. Each of these animals he mentions is a metaphor for one of the characters that's gonna show up later in the opera. He's joined by a clown who's doing one of these one-man band bits, as well as a stagehand who brings out Lulu, who's dressed up like Pierrot, a stock character from the Italian commedia dell'arte tradition. As the first scene opens, Lulu is being painted by a character who's only known as the painter. In this opera, you can get a good idea of how important a character is by whether or not they get a name or just a title. Dr. Schern is also there, and you can tell he's important because he gets both a name and a title. Alva, who's Dr. Schern's son, comes in. Alva is a composer, and when he leaves, he takes his dad with him. The painter then flirts with Lulu and pursues her around the studio, culminating in a sculpture getting knocked over. Then there's a knock at the door. It's Lulu's husband, the medical specialist. Lulu and the painter both freak out, and the medical specialist barges in anyway, sees Lulu's infidelity, and has a heart attack right on the spot. Lulu can't quite seem to grasp the fact that he's dead. And when the painter calls her out on this, he's like, "What are you?" And she's like, "I don't know." The painter talks to the corpse and then says, "Yo, you are so lucky. I would give anything to trade places with you right now." By the next scene, Lulu and the painter are married, and the painter is happy at the various successes he's having in the art world. But Lulu gets wind that Dr. Schern is engaged, which upsets and distracts her. Shigolsh, an old beggar with severe asthma, comes in and gets some money from Lulu, and when he's walking out, Dr. Schern comes in and is like, "Yo, what's your dad doing here?" And Lulu's like, "Oh, that's not my dad." And Dr. Schern goes, "Okay, well, stay out of my business because, look, I know we've had an affair for a long time." Yeah, big surprise there. "But I set you up with your previous two husbands, so I don't want any funny business when I'm marrying my wife." Then the painter comes back in, and Dr. Schern tells him pretty much everything, except he embellishes here and there to get the painter all worked up. And it works, because the painter then commits suicide. Soon enough, Alva comes in bringing news of revolution in Paris, and they all hope that the news from the international world will cover up the death of Lulu's second husband in the local press. Schern is disgusted by Lulu's indifference to the painter's death, but Lulu still has her sights set on Schern to be her third husband. In the next scene, Lulu is preparing for a dance performance. Alva is smitten, as is an unnamed prince, who apparently wants to make Lulu his princess. As Lulu leaves to perform, Alva says, "You know, this could really make an interesting opera." But no, I couldn't. No one would ever believe it. In a commotion, Lulu returns from the performance, having fainted at the sight of Dr. Schern and his fiancée. An irritated Dr. Schern comes into the room to see what all the commotion is about, but he too is just too entranced by Lulu's spell. She dictates a letter to him that he writes down, breaking off his engagement to his fiancée, and as he does so, he says he can feel the execution coming. And as well he should. It's not like Lulu's husbands have a good track record of, staying alive or anything. In Act 2, we meet the Countess Geschwitz, a lesbian noblewoman whose love for Lulu is unrequited. She visits Lulu at her and Schern's house in order to invite her to a ball. When Geschwitz leaves, Schern pulls out a revolver and starts yelling about how jealous he is. Lulu manages to talk him down, this time, but as they retire to an inner room, it turns out that Lulu has let a lot of people into this house, or they've found a way in somehow. Geschwitz sneaks back in, as does Shigolsh and two other characters, the athlete and the schoolboy. They all start to converse until a servant announces that Dr. Schern, who was apparently supposed to be at the stock market, is due to return, so they all hide. But it's a different Schern. Alva enters, and he begins to furiously flirt with Lulu. Lulu even heavily implies that she poisoned Alva's mother, and that doesn't even faze him. What they don't know is that Dr. Schern has actually returned. He's seen all this go down, and he's furious. He chases all the other characters out of the house with his revolver and then gives the gun to Lulu, saying that she has two options. Either kill herself, or he'll kill her and make it look like a suicide. What's not good is to give a gun to the person that you say you want to kill, and Lulu uses this opportunity to fire 5 shots into Dr. Schern, killing him. Alva comes in, he sees all this carnage, and, well, he wants to call the police. But Lulu tries to convince him otherwise. She begs him, she says, "I'll always be faithful to you," and you know, it's like not like she has a good track record on doing that, so like I understand why Alva still called the police. Like, you kind of have to at some point. The good news is that from here on out, no other husband of Lulu dies. Bad news is that she never remarries. And pretty much everyone else in the opera dies too, but it's opera, it goes with the territory. Between the scenes of Act 2 comes a silent film, which is intended to be palindromic. It is at the very center of the opera, between the two scenes of Act 2, which is itself the second act, and is intended to show a one-year time-lapse of Lulu being imprisoned, contracting cholera, and then the Countess Geschwitz contracting cholera herself in order to sneak in and switch clothes with Lulu and thus break Lulu out of prison. The second scene of Act 2 comes exactly 1 year later, and the Countess's plot was successful as Lulu has returned.
A great success!
Szygolcs, who's there for some reason, knows that they don't have a lot of time to get out of Germany, so he goes off to buy train tickets to Paris. Once everybody else is gone, Lulu begins a duet with Alva, who still loves her even though they're making out on the same bed that Dr. Schön bled out on just a year prior. Like, Alva, man, I get it if she's that hot, but you gotta have a little bit of self-control here. She murdered your dad! The third and final act begins in Paris. Lulu is living under an assumed name, and she and all the other protagonists of this little opera are at a party. One of the guests at the party is the Marquis, who knows exactly who Lulu is and wants to profit a little off of this knowledge. He's a human trafficker who will get a pretty penny if he's able to ship Lulu off to a brothel in Cairo, and if that proves impossible, just taking her to the police would get him a good sum. Lulu offers to pay the Marquis, but he's smart and he knows that all of their money, well, all of Alva's money, because Lulu and Alva are in some kind of relationship at this point, is tied up in shares for the Jungfrau Railroad, and he gives her a deadline of later in that same day. To make matters even worse, the athlete is still hanging around, and he thinks that this is precisely the time he needs to take to also blackmail Lulu because he knows what went down and he knows who she really is. And then a telegram arrives informing the entire party that the Jungfrau Railroad just went to belly up and they're all broke. So she's now broke and she's getting blackmailed in two different directions, and she turns to Szygolcs for help. He has once again showed up to ask for money, and he may or may not be Lulu's father, but he desperately wants Lulu. And Lulu knows that she can use that to her advantage. She says that she'll pay him if he kills the athlete, and then turns around and tells Geschwitz that she needs to sleep with the athlete because she's told the athlete that if Geschwitz sleeps with him, Geschwitz will pay her and then she can pay the athlete. It's very complicated, and Geschwitz, who's done all this unreciprocated stuff for Lulu already, feels super put upon, but she agrees to the deal anyway. Lulu then switches clothes with her valet and escapes with Alva, but they're now completely broke. In the second and final scene, Alva, Szygolcs, who presumably killed the athlete off stage, Lulu and Geschwitz are living in another part of the world, in a shabby London attic. And they ask themselves, how did they get here? Lulu is making money now by being a prostitute, and it turns out that it's her first day on the job. The three clients that she takes in this scene mirror her three husbands, because Berg had them portrayed by the same actors in the same order. Lulu's first client is silent, echoing the fact that the medical specialist was a speaking role earlier in the opera. The second one kills Alva in a fit of rage, and Geschwitz is so distraught that she considers suicide. She doesn't go through with it because Lulu's third and final client, Jack the Ripper, comes in. Because Jack the Ripper is portrayed by the same actor as Dr. Schön earlier on, Lulu immediately proclaims that she loves him and doesn't even ask for payment. Now alone, Geschwitz says that she wants to return to Germany and fight for women's rights. But she doesn't have a chance to do this, because she hears Lulu's death scream. She rushes to the door, Jack the Ripper opens the door, and also stabs her. Alban Berg's Lulu. Fun for the whole family. Lulu was adapted by Berg from two plays by playwright Frank Wedekind, an early figure in German expressionist theater and a major influence on Bertolt Brecht. This was Berg's second opera after Wozzeck. It took Berg quite a bit of time to condense the source material, Erdgeist and Die Buchse der Pandora, or Earth Spirit and Pandora's Box in English, into a single workable drama. So instead of just being a mere retelling, Berg's story changes and adapts and condenses, and even in some cases adds things. So we're really seeing Wedekin's story through the lens of Berg. The whole bit about Lulu's 3 husbands coming back, disguised as the 3 clients at the very end, that is all Berg. He liked these kinds of symmetries and echoes to previous points. It's why the whole opera is symmetrical and is divided in the middle by that short film, which the score for that is itself just a massive palindrome. I mean, that is all Berg, and because it's not really in the Wedekind original, they're originally going to be 4 clients. And of course, there's no way to even that out with Lulu's 3 husbands, unless Alva then becomes the 4th husband, and it was just a little bit too much. Berg originally did want to have these 4 at the end to keep it, close to what Wedekind originally intended, but had to cut it down just for purposes of size and scope, and also just because the dramatic form works a lot better. Lulu proved to be Berg's last work, and he tried so hard to complete it before his death, but he just wasn't able to. He finished the first 2 acts entirely, and had finished the 3rd act in short score, and was just about to orchestrate it, but he ran out of time because he'd gotten a commission earlier on for a violin concerto, which, again, as I've said before on this channel, this is one of my favorite violin concertos of all time. And I can't blame him, because he really needed these funds because the Nazi regime had put a ban on Berg's music in Germany. Over time, Elena became more and more protective of the 3rd act. She wouldn't let it be performed, published, or even looked at. She actually tried to have it destroyed, but a completion of it was commissioned in secret, and the full opera was premiered not long after her death. You sometimes hear Lulu referred to as the first 12-tone opera, and while this is true on some levels, it's not entirely accurate. Berg's compositional choices, even in his 12-tone pieces, reveal a more romantic and intuitive composer than the other members of the Second Viennese school. His approach to using tone rows in his music differs wildly from his teacher Arnold Schoenberg's. Schoenberg's opera Moses und Aaron is based around a single tone row, which Schoenberg always kept intact and used as the basis for all of his music. This gave compositional uniformity at the expense of variety and expression, and sustaining a variety of expression across the length of an entire opera is a very difficult thing to do if you're using one single tone row, and is a large reason as to why Moses und Aaron went incomplete. Berg set out to do the exact same thing in Lulu, and this row, this initial tone row, is known to analysts as the basic set. But Berg soon realized how limiting it was to try to write unique expressive vocal lines for each of his characters if everybody had to have the same tone row. So as an experiment, Berg used a commission for a concert aria for a soprano and orchestra called Der Wein, where he experimented with expanding and developing music through expanding and developing tone rows. This worked to Berg's satisfaction, and he then went back to Lulu, which he'd stopped working on to write Der Wein. He goes back to Lulu, and then he extracts different tone rows from the basic set, these subsidiary tone rows which sometimes are quite similar to the basic set, and sometimes he puts them through so many processes that it's just impossible to tell where they came from. They might as well at some points be entirely novel tone rows, but they all have unique relationships not just to the basic set, but to one another. Additionally, some characters, most notably Countess Geschwitz and the athlete, don't have tone rows at all. That is, they don't have a single identifiable theme of 12 consecutive pitches, which all together encompass the chromatic set. Instead, they have something called serial tropes, where the pitches are ordered, and there are 12 of them, but there are natural points of division in there. The groups can be rearranged, or the notes within the groups can be rearranged. Countess Geschwitz has 2 pentatonic scales and a perfect fifth, and so her row is treated as a serial trope. As long as these elements are present and distinct from one another in some way, the exact presentation of them in a certain order isn't the point. This was anathema to Schoenberg's compositional style and how he treated tone rows, and even though he was commissioned first, or rather approached first, to complete Lulu after Berg's death, he declined. He knew that he just couldn't get into that hyper-mathematical world and be expressive in it in the same way that his student was. Well, I mean, I shouldn't say hyper-mathematical. It was a mix of mathematics and intuition. But Berg does like using a lot of numerology and encoding secret messages into his works, which is what makes his music more different and more expressive and emotionally nuanced than a lot of pieces by Schoenberg or Webern. There is actually tonal music in the third act, as Berg constructs a theme and variations on a cabaret song by Wedekind himself, which rewards listeners who are familiar with the original source material. And there's no way to account for all of the atonal elements in the score purely by looking at tone rows and serial tropes and trying to find all of them. You could find all of them, and there's still elements in the score that elude your analysis. There are still these freely atonal elements, but being familiar with the tone rows and what they mean and their associations with different characters gives you a lot of insight as to what is exactly going on in the musical language. For instance, if you find a character singing another character's row, it's indicative that that character is either thinking of that other character whose row they're singing, or they're somehow embodying or encompassing something that the other character represents. This complexity can be extended to the relationship between tone rows. For instance, Alva is, in the original plays, a mouthpiece for Wedekind, and he uses that role in order to create these comments that Alva makes that lean heavily on the fourth wall. When Berg decided to adapt this, he didn't keep Alva as a stand-in for Wedekind, the original author, but rather took some ownership over the drama by making Alva his own mouthpiece. It of course occurred to him, couldn't have not occurred to him, rather, that Alva and Alban were very similar sounding names. And it certainly wasn't lost on him that Alva's father, Dr. Schön, had a very similar name to his teacher, Arnold Schoenberg. So Alva becomes a more autobiographical character, while on a metatextual level, Dr. Schön embodies Schoenberg. Their tone rows are not just similarly derived from the basic set, but they have parallels with one another. One starts with an A major triad, the other starts with an A minor triad, etc. Not to be outdone, the Countess Geschwitz, who is really the only selfless, genuinely sympathetic character in the entire drama, and who Wedekind identified as the true heroine of the story, is identified with Berg's sister Smaragda. Smaragda was also a lesbian, and their relationship, which impacted Berg's relatively liberal for the time views on gay rights, impacted his characterization of Geschwitz. Schigolch, on the other hand, has a tone row that's almost a fully chromatic scale, and chromaticism, being the basis of the 12-tone system, is seen as the most base level of humanity. And this is just talking about the tone rows. There's so much more in this opera going into the characterization, going into the structure alone, because there are sonatas and rondos and all these other really complicated musical forms, palindromes I mentioned earlier, that are packed into this, and they're overlaid, and there's just so much you could spend. Really, there are scholars out there who have spent significant portions of their career or their entire career to negotiating and analyzing these kinds of things, and so it's not really something that I feel comfortable with trying to condense down to a single YouTube video. But I will say that if you are interested in any of this further, I definitely recommend certain books that have helped me out when I took a class on this last year, and I'll link those, or rather I'll reference those down in the description if you're interested in checking those out.